Here we are again with another DuckTank talk. Number 2 after 7 months, which is why so much looks different now. As you can see, I've got like a slightly different setup. I've got a nicer microphone now. I've actually been using this for a lot of reviews lately, so that's why the audio quality has seemingly been better. But yeah, it's been a while. I have plenty of ideas for this video series. I just haven't been taking the time to do anything with those ideas. And I really wanted to do this video much sooner. In fact, I technically did do this video much sooner. I originally recorded a version of this video back in August of 2024. It is now January 2025. And I just didn't like how that one ended up looking and turned out, and there were a lot of things with like the lighting and the positioning and stuff that I wanted to change. So we're doing it again. Also because I'm kind of getting burned out on doing scripted toy videos, so I'm giving myself a little bit of a mental breather. But this isn't supposed to be 10 to 15 minutes of preamble. This is supposed to be a video about a number of different things, not a specific count, but just a number of different things that I wish I had known when I first got back into toy collecting. Totally random and weird how it happened. I won't go into the story now, but I got back into collecting and there were so many things that I really wish I knew once I had decided to get back into it, because not only have things changed had things changed in the decade or so I've been absent from things, but also there are just a lot of things when you're collecting stuff, whether it's transforming robot toys or Funko Pops, which yes, we all laugh and roll our eyes at that, but it's a thing. People enjoy them, so it's a legitimate thing for people to collect. No matter what you collect, there are certain things that, you know, you kind of pick up as you go. And that's what this video is. This is a number of different things that I've learned since getting back into collecting that I really wish I knew in advance when I went back into it that first time, because it would have made things so much easier and probably saved me a lot of money. First thing seems obvious, but it's something that I'd never even considered until I was well into it, is just how important space is, by which I mean physical space. There are different ways of collecting. There are people who collect to just have the thing, and then there are people like myself who collect to display. I personally, I'm not saying the other way is wrong, just the way I like to do it is I want to display the figures I own. If I buy something, it needs to be able to fit out on a shelf for display. It's not going to sit in storage. If I'm inclined to put something in storage, that means I have to sell it, basically. Because we don't physically have the space here for one thing, but also again, I'm just very display oriented. That's not to say again that collecting and storing figures but keeping them in your collection is wrong. This is totally valid. It's just in either scenario, you want to make sure you have that space pre-planned. Obviously, you're not going to be able to plan for everything. You're not necessarily going to know how big your collection is going to get until it really starts to grow. But you do at least want to start with a slightly more robust amount of space than you might initially think, with at least ideas of what you might do in order to expand that. Because when I first got started, I had a bookcase, like a small bookcase, that I kept board games on. And my first foray getting back into collecting was just one shelf on that bookcase. That doesn't work anymore. The thing you can barely see behind me right now should be evidence enough of that. But yeah, it's just something that you always want to keep in mind if you're serious. Like if you're really seriously planning on collecting, just try and figure out shelf space, and also think about not just shelf space, but storage space if you store stuff. But also pay attention to that when you're buying new stuff. Something I do a lot is if I'm going to buy a figure, I have to look at my shelves and be like, where is this going to fit? That's the thing you got to think of. And if you buy a figure yourself and you do the storage thing, you'll want to think, okay, I've got this. Am I going to store it in its box? Am I going to store it in some other method? If whichever way I choose to store it, where is this going to go? And if it isn't going to fit where you plan to put it, what can you do to make space for it? Whether that's rearranging or selling stuff off. It's just something you got to think about. The second thing that I really wish I had done going back into the collecting, was having a sort of game plan to start. what people want out of their collection can change. And it does change, because people change. I started recollecting like 7 or 8 years ago at this point, and what I wanted for the collection 7 or 8 years ago is vastly different than what I want for it now, because my wants and interests have changed. Be open to that shift in what you prioritize, but it's usually a good idea to have some kind of plan going in. That could be anything from having a representation of every single character that appeared in the first season of the G1 cartoon, to a specific scale, to one specific character, to only having one version of a given character, regardless of whether it's G1 or IDW or whatever. Are you going to draw a line in the sand and only do official stuff, or are you open to third-party stuff? Are you open to KOs? There's just a lot of little factors, and you don't necessarily need to figure it all out, but it definitely helps to have a sort of broad strokes idea of at least where you want to start. Because where I first started was just, that looks cool, I'm gonna get it. That in itself isn't a bad or incorrect way to collect. It's just that's generally not the way that it's going to stay for a lot of people. I'm sure there are people where that's just what their collecting is, and that's fine. But like for me, it did not stay that way for long, because that looks cool, I want it, led to things getting out of hand pretty quickly, which we'll touch on that too. Having some kind of idea, at least at first, where you want to start with your collection can help to sort of guide you, and also having a not necessarily set in stone strict way of doing things, but like just a general set of guidelines to follow can help to both make the collection more cohesive and deter you from spending a bunch of money on stuff that you may end up deciding doesn't really fit with what you're doing, and not even after all that long. There have definitely been times where I bought a figure because I thought it looked cool, and then within a month I was like, you know, this doesn't really fit with what I've got going on here, so then I sold it off, and it's like I could have just not bought the figure, you know? This is another one that I feel like is pretty obvious, but it still is something that I didn't really think of when I first got back into all this, and that is, the bigger the collection gets, the bigger the job it ends up being. And this applies to people who, you know, have figures in storage and stuff too, but I think primarily I'm speaking about it in terms of my own experiences, which involves display. Because when you have a small collection that's displayed, like just a couple of bookshelves, it's really not that hard to rearrange things or come up with a, you know, slight organization to it all, to clean stuff, because that is going to happen every now and then. You want to like dust things, unless you've got hermetically sealed cases, which is a whole other thing. You are sometimes probably going to need to change up the displays and, you know, dust and things like that. And just the bigger the collection gets, the more physical figures you have, the longer that's going to take and the more work it's going to take. I basically try to dust my collection every 3 months or so, because it's such a big job. I just don't have it in me to do it like once a month, let alone once a week, because it's this whole process of like taking everything off the shelf, dusting each figure with a big paintbrush thing that I have, and then dusting the shelves themselves, and then dusting I use risers and stuff like that, so I've got to dust those, and then putting it all back. The last time I dusted my collection, which was I think in either late, like mid-November or early December 2024, the last time I dusted it, it took me about 5 hours of just constant taking figures off the shelf, dusting them, dusting the shelves, and so on. So yeah, the bigger it is, the more work it's going to be. And that also applies to if, you know, you're just changing things up. Like, I've had to rearrange my shelves multiple times as my criteria for collecting changes, and also as my Nemesis Prime collection, or technically it's black repaints of Prime figures, but I just call it the Nemesis collection because it's faster. My Nemesis Prime collection has grown a lot. It's up to around 40 figures now, and that is multiple shelves. So I've had to rearrange things to get all of those to fit, and arrange them in a way where they fit in a way that makes sense. So like each shelf is a different category of some fashion. And so that now means that a collection that used to take up 2 shelves now takes up 4. So those other 2 shelves had to come from somewhere. So then I had to move a bunch of other stuff around and figure out where everything else is going to go. And it's just, you know, a bigger collection means it's a lot more effort. And this is one that is very much a me problem, but I imagine other people have dealt with this too. When you're getting into collecting, getting back into collecting, you really, really need to pay attention to your finances. I was not like grossly irresponsible when buying toys, but I was definitely irresponsible in some fashion or another for a while. And it's not even necessarily big stuff. Like I'm not at a point where I wasn't ever at a point where it was like, oh, here's this $500 super expensive Gao figure that I really like and want to get. I'm going to just buy it. I went in with a plan. I listed a bunch of stuff on eBay and stuff like that to try and, sell and save up for it. But you still need to pay attention to that stuff. You need to really think about where you're at, what you can swing. And more than anything, the problem isn't the big ticket stuff, it's the small stuff. It is so easy to be like, here's this older Cybertron figure that I've been wanting for a while, and hey, it's only $30. The next week, it's like, here's this classic G1 figure that's, $40. Here's a, $20 Armada figure that I've been wanting, and so on and so forth. Taken on their own, that's fine. But adding it up over the course of just a few weeks, suddenly you're spending like $100, $200, even $300 on all these figures, and it's like, that just can become a problem, Especially if the stuff you're getting is primarily, you're primarily jumping on it because, oh, that's a good price, or, oh, I've been curious about that, and that's an affordable price. Like, what helps for me, this may not be for everybody, but what helps for me is kind of coupling this with that idea of having a specific plan, or not specific, but just having a general idea of like how you want to approach collecting, to the point where there are figures now that I've wanted that I've chosen to skip out or to miss because it's just a combination of, yeah, that looks cool and I want it, but do I want it enough to, work it into the collection? The cost involved, like there's just so many factors that I try and think of now. Lines have to be drawn as the collection gets bigger, as more money gets spent, as space gets to become a premium, and this is one of those things where you just, everyone has to eventually start to think about this stuff. Now, something that I did actually do a little bit going into it, but it's something that I still think is good to keep in mind, is doing your research. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to dig for video reviews on every single figure you want to buy. There have definitely been times where there have been figures that I knew I wanted to get, and it's just like, nothing is going to change my mind, I'm going to get that figure. That's fine. But it's always a good idea for anything that you're unsure of or maybe curious about to try and find some form of discussion about it first. That could be YouTube videos, that could be TFW discussions over on the forums. Though the TFW discussions, it's, you kind of want to you have to sift through a lot of nitpicky belly aching to really get to what might be valid things regarding a given figure. Anyone who's been to TFW, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's just a good idea. There have been figures that I've been interested in, and then I see that a fair number of people have common QC issues with it, and it's like, maybe I should wait. Maybe they'll fix it down the road or something like that. Point is, doing research is usually a good idea, in some capacity. If nothing else, it feeds back into what I was saying before about space, where you can look at a figure and be like, okay, how big is it? Because I've done that. With certain like third-party and oversized knockoff figures, it's like, okay, I want this Megatron because it'll go really well on the Megatron shelf, but how big is it really? And then I have to pull out a tape measure to see if it'll actually fit on the shelf. I have actually done this. It's just a good habit to get into. Yet another important thing is knowing what a figure is worth, because especially when it comes to aftermarket stuff, what someone's asking for a figure isn't necessarily related in any way to how much it's actually worth. There have been so many eBay listings I've seen for toys where it's like, you have got to be kidding me with that price. And this isn't just eBay, but I see it a lot on eBay, but it's like aftermarket in general, where you've got what the thing is actually selling for, because you can look at sold listings to see, what a given figure has actually sold for recently, and then what the current listing prices are. And if the figure last sold like a month ago for $60, and the cheapest option you can see right now is $150, don't buy the $150 one because that is a ripoff. There's always some wiggle room with this kind of stuff because a lot of it is like supply versus demand, especially on the aftermarket. A lot of times there are people who try really blatantly to take advantage. Again, like, I'm not talking about, hey, this figure retails for $50 and they're asking $65. I'm talking like this figure retails for $50 and they're asking over $100. Like, that is nonsense. And that applies to stuff that is currently supposed to be available but is hard to find, stuff that's coming out early, or not coming out early, but stuff that's due to come out that just isn't out in your area yet or whatever, and you're like anxious to get it. Aftermarket stuff, you just really want to have a better idea of the worth of a figure before you attempt to buy it, because if it's over the top in terms of price, just wait. Most of the time, even if there aren't any listings for a figure that you really want or any affordable ones, you can eventually find one that is affordable by just waiting. It doesn't even necessarily have to be eBay. It could be local shops that deal in like secondhand stuff, possibly flea markets, possibly even like secondhand stores, conventions, and toy shows and stuff like that. All those places are potential spots where you could find what you're looking for at a much better price than some of the nonsense that people are asking for in the aftermarket sometimes. And that's actually a good segue into the next thing, which is to be patient. There are, again, very few instances where you really need to jump on something as soon as it's available. Most of the time, even if it's a really good price, there's a pretty decent chance that you're going to find it for a similar, if not equal or better price somewhere down the line. So if it's not the right time for you, either financially or space-wise, or, turmoil in your life, like you're moving or whatever, and you just don't want to deal with the hassle, just be patient. You don't have to buy it immediately, which is definitely something that took me a while to to internalize. It's something I still struggle with sometimes. There are always going to be exceptions. It just, as a general rule, it's a good idea to, not jump the gun on things. With a very few exceptions, you're very likely to find what you want at a better price than what you're currently seeing it for. You just have to be patient. And this is a concept I think I briefly touched on before, but circling back to it now, and that's, it's easier to buy a figure than it is to sell one. That seems kind of like a weird thing to bring up, but it's something that I wish I'd known, because it is generally so much easier to be like, oh, here's this thing, it's available now, I've got this money, I'm going to buy it. But then if you have this figure and you suddenly decide you don't want it anymore, or you got it and you end up not liking it, which kind of feeds back into the whole research thing and various other things I've been talking about already, then it's like, what do you do with this thing? Some people might just tuck it off to the side and, put it in storage or whatever, which is fine. I personally, though, don't see a point in hanging on to a figure I don't like or really want, so I'm just going to sell it. But the problem with that is, barring a few exceptions, selling a figure is usually much more difficult. It relies on other people being interested, other people agreeing to the prices that you think you want, you should be able to get for it. There's the whole, figure worth thing, which feeds back on, on itself now. And it's like, okay, I bought this thing for $35. Maybe if I'm lucky, I'll sell it for $19. All of that stuff can really kind of drag things down a bit. And it's just, it is so much easier to, ultimately, at least, it's easier to resist the urge to buy the figure in the first place and simply not have spent that money, rather than try to recoup some of what you spent by selling it off later. If you're collecting for the interest of collecting, I would highly recommend really thinking about the figure you're about to buy before dropping the money on it, because if you change your mind or end up regretting it later, it might be a lot more work to offload it. Now this I feel like I talked about back when I was discussing the whole game plan thing, but it's something to reiterate here, and that's, in most collections, nothing is permanent. I mean, there are going to be people who, they buy a figure, that figure stays in their collection no matter what, and that's fine. But for my experience, and I'm sure for a lot of other people, the collection can be kind of a somewhat fluid thing. It's not going to be the same stagnant thing all the time. It's not just going to be this and then it just keeps growing. It can ebb and flow. It can expand and shrink. You can decide to focus on one particular theme and then change your mind later. It's whatever. But something that I think would have helped going into collecting for me was the idea of accepting the fact that nothing that I do with my collection is intended to be permanent. I'm not locked into having a generations shelf and a masterpiece shelf, or having movie, like live action movie stuff separate from G1 stuff, separate from IDW stuff. All of that can fluctuate based on whatever you personally want to do with it. And for me, what I ended up settling on after several years, and it's a way of categorizing that I think fits me enough that I don't plan on changing it at all, but that may change down the line too, because like I said, nothing is permanent. But for now, the way I like to focus on it is organizing by character. So I don't care about whether it's masterpiece or G1 or live action movie. It's all about the character. So all of my Megatrons and Megatron-ish, so like Galvatron or Megatronus, all of those are on one shelf. All my Ultra Magnuses are on one shelf. All my RCs are on one shelf. All my Ratchets are on one shelf. Like all that stuff. That's how I do it. It took a lot of different iterations to get there, because again, it's not permanent. I mean, at the end of the day, nothing material is really permanent, so we're not going to get into the existential stuff, but it's something to keep in mind. Another thing that has been Astrid cameo. You want to say hi? So another thing that I've learned over the course of several years is sometimes all you need is to just add a little bit of extra pizzazz to what you currently have. Like there have been times where my collection's been in a bit of a rut, whether it's because of interest or money or space or a combination of all those factors, or I'm just depressed and that's affecting my ability to enjoy any of this stuff. There's so many times where things have felt a little bit meh. Just spicing things up a little bit visually has been all that I've needed to maintain my interest. And that could be something like reorganizing the shelves if you do display-oriented stuff, because sometimes it helps to just shift things around. Maybe you want to group all of your Autobots together and have the Decepticons on like the other side of the room. Maybe you want to do battle scenes that are tied into like specific seasons or specific media that they appeared on, like all your Transformers Prime figures together fighting or whatever. It's just there are so many ways to categorize and display Transformers toys, and it can really be its own kind of fun figuring out how to set it up, and then the satisfaction of actually getting it set up is nice. Also, oh, that's a good purr. Also, repro labels. I've got several videos on the channel at this point, like nowhere near as many as the just general toys, but like I've got so many videos on the channel that talk about toy hacks, repro labels, and they really can help. I don't think they're necessary to, make a figure good. If you don't like a figure, you don't like a figure. But the stickers can and do often really spice things up a bit, dress things up a bit. There are a lot of figures that look great on their own. You add those stickers and it just makes them pop a little extra harder. It makes it even easier to love them. It can really help. And the stickers generally are a lot cheaper, both to buy and to ship, than the figures themselves. So if you already have the figures, stickering them up, a lot of the time, for me at least, the experience of stickering up a figure is almost like getting it again for the first time. That's a really fun feeling, and it generally doesn't cost that much to do. So it's something that you can do if you're, if you got a lull in the collecting, or don't have quite the budget that you had previously. That definitely helps. Now, this was one that I definitely needed to know when I first got back into collecting. And again, this sounds obvious, but it's something that I think some of us really need to hear and then seriously ponder. And that is, you are not obligated to own a specific figure. That sounds like a weird thing to say, a weird way to phrase it. But what I mean is, no matter what anyone else says, no matter how excited people are for a given figure, no matter how much people might say, oh, this is something that everyone needs to experience, you are not required to buy that figure. You can. You absolutely can. If it's something you want, then by all means. If it makes you happy, that's awesome. But if it's something that you're not necessarily interested in for one reason or another, like maybe it doesn't fit in with the collection theme that you're going for, maybe it's just not something you're all that interested in for, just because of the way it looks, but suddenly everyone's talking about how great it is and stuff like that, and you feel like maybe you're missing out, or maybe you really should get it because, you know, this seems like the figure to get. That's not an excuse. I mean, you're not bad for getting it for those reasons. It's just, in my experience, it usually doesn't end well. There have been so many times I've gotten a figure that was like, oh, this is an all-timer. I didn't have the initial interest. And so getting it because it was an all-timer, it didn't really make a difference. And so now I'm in that situation where I just bought this figure and now I've got to offload it because I really don't care for it that much. That is just something that I still, to this day, have dealt with. Like Legacy Magmatron is a recent example of that. That figure is really good. I really like Legacy Magmatron. It was something that everybody was saying was fantastic. And I agree, it is fantastic, but for whatever reason, it just didn't keep my enthusiasm after having it for several months. And so I sold it off. A part of me misses it, but a bigger part of me is like, I'm glad I got to experience it in one way or another, but I ultimately think I would have been better off not spending that money in the first place or spending that money on something else. I am not saying that people should avoid Legacy Magmatron, especially if it's something that excites you, but like that feeling of, well, everyone else says it's cool, so I should get it myself. Maybe try and give yourself a little mental pushback the next time you feel that. You know, I'm not saying discount that feeling entirely, but just stop and think about it and be like, do I really want this toy? Or do I want it because everyone else says it's great and I think I should want it? Because if that's the reason, then you might be better off not bothering, or at least waiting for a sale or something, you know? And the last thing that I wish I knew before I got back into collecting is something that kind of ties into everything I've talked about in the video up to this point. And it's something that I've even touched on directly in a couple of places, but I feel like as its own thing, it needs to be talked about. And that is, for whatever you collect, whether it's transforming robots or records or stamps or CDs or pop vinyls or GoBots, Gunpla kits, whatever. It's your collection, so you make the rules. If anything or everything I've said in this video, if you don't think it applies to you, then it doesn't apply to you. Because it's your collection. You get to decide what your collection is and what it's going to be. This is stuff that I feel like could still be universally helpful to at least think about, but ultimately and definitively, your collection is your collection. If you want to mix Transformers and GoBots, official and third party, if you want to just collect third party, if you want to just collect Masterpiece in whatever way that goes, if you just want to collect characters that are like green and purple, whatever the criteria is, whatever you want your collection to be, that is the objectively correct decision for you because it's your collection. Nobody else can tell you you're doing it wrong. If you decide you want to change things down the line, that's totally fine and totally valid because it's your collection. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to not change your mind. There is no way that you can incorrectly collect something you want. Unless somehow through some weird series of events you're actively hurting other people, but I can't really think of a scenario where collecting toys would actively hurt someone else. Unless, I guess, you're going beyond your means, which is something I've done a couple of times. Point is, as long as nobody's getting hurt, there's no wrong way to do it. So just have fun. Or if you don't want to have fun, then don't have fun, because it's your collection. Do it however you want. But just know that nothing anybody says can invalidate how you're handling your collection. So just do whatever brings you some sense of enjoyment, contentment, satisfaction, whatever you're looking to get out of your collection. As long as you're getting that out of your collection in whatever shape it takes, then you're doing it right. And hey, we finished the second ever DuckTank Talk video, which has been re-recorded now for a second time, and at least this time it probably won't languish for months and months and not get posted. One reason why I wanted to do this as my second DuckTank Talk video is because I didn't want them to all be negative or ranty or anything like that. My intention for this series is to, I don't want it to just be Rob ranting. It's just a place where I talk about stuff that I might have potentially been, might have gone off on a tangent in another video, but here it's kind of its own thing. That could be rants, It could be tips like this video is. It could just be a celebration of things, like, I don't know, the fact that the 4-pack Studio Series Jazz or Buzzworthy Jazz doesn't have translucent plastic, which makes him, in my mind, the version to get. I wanted to mix it up because I didn't want to send the message that all of these videos are going to just be me ranting. I have no interest in being that kind of YouTube channel. I don't want to be just another, oh, look at me making fun of this thing, ranting about this thing all the time. I'll do it occasionally, but there's so much of that now, and I hope that this is at least helpful in some regard. But regardless, that is enough of that. I never really know how to close these things out because this is my second ever DuckTank Talk video. So thanks for watching, and schnitz bites. Does anyone get that?